I want us to talk for a little bit about Europe since 1945 as we take a look at chapter 28. There are many challenges which Europe faces after World War II. As you can see in this picture, one of the main things is just the destruction of Europe. World War II brings unbelievable destruction, especially by bombing, as well as loss of life. With that, then, the infrastructure is destroyed. For example, bridges, factories, schools, hospitals, etc. All destroyed. So this brings about many challenges. Also, the economy is in terrible shape, because there has been the fighting that's been going on, the amount of money that's been spent on war, and the amount of money that has been spent on fighting that war and trying to keep everyone fed and so forth. Many people were starving and were in terrible shape. So this is a big challenge. Western Europe will revive democracy, and its economy will revive. In large measure, this is helped out by aid from the West, that is, aid from the United States in the form of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of these nations, and the rebuilding of these economies. Eastern Europe, of course, is under the control, even beyond starting in 1945, under the Soviet Union. And until the Soviet Union collapses in the late 80s, early 90s, there will be a number of problems there economically. And when these new countries emerge out from underneath communism, they're going to face a lot of problems too. So we're going to talk about some of that in the next few minutes here. Let's take a look at France since 1945. You see pictured here Charles de Gaulle, a leading force in France, really during the war and after the war as well. He was a French army officer, a statesman. He was a hero to the French people. I'm sure he still is. He led the French resistance in World War II. And after that, he became the one who set up the provisional government to reestablish democracy, reestablish France following World War II. And because of that, he had a great influence in shaping the way France is since World War II. He led things, he finally retired. But he was called out of retirement to rewrite the Constitution in 1958 and helped to found the Fifth Republic of France. He's then elected president of France in 1959, will serve for 10 years. You see he dies in 1970, so he's pretty much serving almost to the end of his life. After de Gaulle, we see new problems for France. One is a failing economy. With this then comes the rise of the socialists in France, especially under Francois Mitterrand. But his attempts to end the economic problems, for the most part, failed. So we can see in more recent times, France has begun to make a move politically to the right. More nationalism and more conservative politics. One of the challenges that France faces even today is the growing population of Muslims within France. Part of the reason that France has so many Muslims is they once controlled Algeria and Morocco, sections of North Africa, which were Muslim. And many of those people from that area have migrated, have immigrated into France proper. And so there's a growing population of Muslims all across Europe, but France certainly has a large number. And the city of Paris, which is the largest European city, has around, the metro area of Paris has about 12 million people, with almost 2 million of those, 1.7, 1.8, it keeps growing, million are Muslims. And so there has been a growing conflict there between the Muslims and many of the people of France. This has led actually to terrorist attacks, and various ones. Probably the most shocking one came in November of 2015 with the attacks on Paris. This was a coordinated attack where multiple sites were hit, including all in the same evening, including a theater that the rebels, the terrorists, blocked it off and then killed people inside the theater. So 130 people were killed that night, and over 400 wounded. And so there are a great amount of tensions with Muslims, especially in France. So this is a challenge that they face. And so here we see the picture dating back to 2015, Pray for Paris. Well, let's look at Germany for a moment. Germany, of course, has some unique challenges because if you remember, after World War II, Germany is divided. Here you see a map of Germany. You see how it is divided. This green part is the British section, the blue, the French, this gold color, the US, the red part is the Soviet Union. And if you notice here, there is Berlin, and Berlin itself was divided into 4 sections. And we've talked some about that before, but eventually the sections of Britain, France, and the United States will unite. They will merge. Efforts to bring in the Soviet part, of course, were not going to happen. That's the same in Berlin, as well as here in the rest of France. And so we see then this is a unique challenge for Germany. So we have eventually then formed after World War II our 2 distinct nations. So Germany began the war unified. It will end the war divided, east and west. We see, for example, the German Democratic Republic, DDR. This is the Soviet part of Germany. That's this red part over here. East Germany, it's usually called. East Germany is then communist, ruled by the communist government from 1945. Ruled from 1945 really up to about 1990 under communist control. And as a country from 1949 to 1990. Because there was an attempt those first 4 years, from 44 to 49, to try to unify Germany, bring it back as one nation. When it became clear that wasn't going to happen, then 2 independent nations were formed. The Federal Republic of Germany, FDR, forms in 1949 out of the 3 areas of the other allies, U.S., British, and French territories. West Germany's economy will boom in World War II, post-World War II, with a lot of help from the Marshall Plan in the West, especially the United States. the United States and the West will rebuild the western part of Germany, will rebuild the western part of Berlin, and the economy there just really is very strong and resurges. Annacher, the chancellor, will build up the economy coming out of the say 40s, the 50s, and we're going to see he is the chancellor for many years, from 1949 to 1963. And in 1971, he introduces a treaty that would open a more, that wasn't opens the East, but it's a more opening view. He called it Ostpolitik, an opening to the East, which would allow for more trade with eastern part of Germany, eastern part of Berlin. And of course, this gains him a Nobel Peace Prize and things like that, and does a lot to strengthen the ties between the two Germanys. We'll jump ahead then to the time of Helmut Kohl, Chancellor, who was Chancellor for a long time, from 1982 to 1998. And he has the main challenge of overseeing the reunion, the union between the East and West Germany to bring Germany back as a unified nation. That begins in 1990, and you see he oversees the first 8 years or so of this process, which were quite challenging because East Germany had been devastated economically, and the Soviet Union had not put any money into rebuilding it after the war. In fact, they had taken resources away, actually moving factories. They would take a German factory, disassemble it, even the buildings and the equipment, and they would move it into the Soviet Union, bring German workers or managers to show them how to run it, and then they just took it over. This is what the Soviets saw as their repayment for what the Germans had done in the war to them. And so consequently, the economy was in terrible shape in the East. And so when these two countries do come back together again in 1990, it's very challenging because East Germany, its living standard is so much lower than West Germany that still today it's not, they've not overcome all those challenges, but they've gone a long ways to do that. But this has been one of the unique things about Germany in post-World War II. Now, another major player in the history here of Germany, recent history of Germany, of course, is Angela Merkel, who is a chancellor since 2005. And she was a protege of Helmut Kohl. She has an interesting background. She is born in West Germany. Her father was, I believe, a Lutheran minister who was moved to a congregation in East Germany when she was a child. And so she grew up in East Germany while she is born in West Germany. So perhaps a unique situation for her to help bring the two parts of Germany together. Some people have called her the most powerful woman in the world. I don't know what Oprah would think of that, but she certainly has been a dominant influence in Germany, but not only Germany, but in the European Union that we're going to talk about in a moment. Well, Great Britain, we're going to talk about another powerful lady here in a moment. But, you know, Great Britain had its own challenges. You know, Great Britain is going to have major economic problems. One of the things, of course, they will face is the loss of their empire. It was said that the sun would never set on the British Empire. And of course, with all the problems of World War I and World War II, rising nationalism and so forth, the British Empire will be lost. And with that, a lot of the influence and power of Great Britain and their economic influence. Interestingly, you know, Winston Churchill had been a hero during World War II. He led Great Britain as their prime minister from 1940 to 1945 during the war. He had brought them through some terrible times. However, politically, Britain had been moving more to the left, and there had been a coalition that had been formed during the war, I think, as a kind of emergency thing. And Clement Attlee, who's from the Labour Party, while Churchill's from the Conservative Party. Right after the war, in 1945, Attlee is elected prime minister, defeating Winston Churchill. By the way, Attlee will be defeated by Winston Churchill in 1951, a few years later. So interesting history there, but one that I think shows how Great Britain is somewhat divided. They move pretty far to the left, but then attempt to move back again. And this swinging back and forth has been there. Well, Attlee was the one who is credited with creating a British welfare state. This becomes a kind of model for other nations, especially in Europe and to some extent here in the United States. He nationalizes the banks, the coal industry, the steel industry, public transportation, utilities, and socializes medicine in Great Britain. But all of this led to financial problems. This is all very, very expensive to do. And this is what brought the Conservative Party back into power with Winston Churchill in 1951. The Conservatives have moved things back further to the right. They have never eliminated all of these changes that took place under Attlee. For example, socialized medicine. But there is a kind of movement now, I think, that's more conservative in Great Britain. We might see these changes, some more changes in the future. There were a lot of economic problems, and eventually the woman pictured here, Margaret Thatcher, will come into power as the prime minister in 1979, and she will be the longest serving prime minister in recent times, certainly in the 20th century. 11 years, and she's very tough. She's tough on the union. She's tough on those who oppose her. She earns the nickname the Iron Lady because she's quite tough. And so this is sometimes called, her conservatism is sometimes called Thatcherism. Thatcherism was the thing that broke the power of the labor unions in Great Britain and brought many of these things to a more privatized system. Because of this, she is a pivotal character, also controversial. Some people really love her, some people really do not. She died in 2013. Now, more recently, part of the problems that has come is caused by what's now called Brexit. And we'll mention that a little more here on the next screen. But Brexit has caused political upheaval because Great Britain joined the European Union. And most famously, they had a vote a few years back to leave, about 5 years ago, to leave the European Union, and they did leave. However, their exiting of the European Union has been difficult. Politically, it's been difficult economically, and they have finally now, I think, negotiated a way to leave. This is supposed to be finally in place by December of 2020. So let's talk about that European Union since it comes up here. The European Union was actually formed fairly early on, in at least the roots of it in the 1970s, with an economic kind of agreements between European countries. but it began to move more and more towards trying to create a sort of confederation of nations in Europe. So they wanted to standardize trade uh, laws and other laws so that basically the way it is now in Europe under the European Union is that there is citizenship of, if you're in Germany or France or Italy or Greece, you are all citizens of Europe. And so the way it used to be when you went to Europe and you wanted to go from France to Germany, you were leaving one country and entering another, and you'd have a checkpoint, you'd have your passport stamped and so forth. Now, when you enter Europe, you get a stamp that you're entering the European Union, and you don't, you could cross all those other borders, just like you're crossing from states in the Union here in the United States. And so this has created some economic benefits, I suppose, in some ways, but it's created a lot of other perhaps unforeseen problems. There was eventually a common currency which comes into place in the 90s. This is called the euro. And so all of these countries, except for Great Britain had never switched, not every single one of them, but almost all of them switched to the euro. So the euro has become a powerful monetary unit. And so in other words, if you get your money, if you get euros, you can spend them in Spain, France, Greece, so forth. You don't have to switch. There are no money. There used to be francs in France. There used to be drachmas in Greece. There used to be lira in Italy and so forth. But now it's all euros. A lot of this was really finalized in 1993. It's a major treaty called the Maastricht Treaty of 1993. Will bring about European citizenship. And basically what it's done is also to allow free trade. So goods from, let's say, Italy would have to be allowed into France, or they would have to be considered like they were domestic. This has created a lot of problems too, because these commodities have changed the prices and so forth across Europe. In all, up to today, 27 nations have joined. Originally, I guess there was 28, but now there's only 27 because Great Britain has left. You can see on the map here, they have already on this map removed Great Britain from the European Union. All these other green colors are the EU members. Well, at any rate, we see then that Britain has exited. So Britain plus exit equals Brexit. So this is what most people are calling it. It's really caught on. Brexit then was approved by a vote in June of 2016. And most people voted for this. So we'll see that Brexit voted for in 2016. It appears that when they survey people, most of the people who voted for it because of the idea that Britain could control its own borders and laws. Because one of the unforeseen problems with the European Union, with this idea that all these borders are open, once someone can make it into one country, they then can make their way around to all the other countries. And so as you can see, as there have been troubles, say in Africa, troubles in the Middle East with Syria and so forth, these refugees have come across into Turkey here. Then they make their way into Greece, and then from Greece they go to Italy, they go, well, all over Europe. And so this has created problems. There's even been refugees who have come who wanted to get to Britain, of course, have to go across the water. Well, there's another way. You can go through the tunnel. There is sometimes used to be called the Channel. It's basically an underground tunnel which connects London. It goes from the southern part of England into France, and there's a train there that can take people back and forth between France and England. What some of these people were doing is that they would also transport trucks that way. So they have on the train, they would have cargo and open areas with trucks on it. You go under the sea. I've been on that train. It goes quite quickly, but the people would get on there and they would sort of hide on there. And once they got over into England, then of course they could go from there. So there's just been a lot of problems with refugees, immigration, problems with trade, goods, farmers feeling like they're being undercut by the goods from other parts of Europe. There's even been laws over, who has the right to name something and control a certain kind of food. There's just been a lot of unforeseen problems there. So the European Union has been problematic, and while for the most part it seems intact, but it has been strained. And the exit of Great Britain, who is one of its major members economically and so forth, might well be a challenge. Will it spell what things to come? Will others exit? I don't know. But I do know financially there's been problems because some of these areas, like for example, Spain and Greece and Italy, have a lot of poverty, a lot of low economy and that sort of stuff, while places like France and Germany, especially Germany, quite wealthy. And so what's actually had to happen once they converted to the euro is that the prices for goods in places like Spain and Greece basically have gone up because they converted from, say, the drachma to the euro, and they tended to just round the numbers up there. But the salaries are much lower. So, you go in one day, you could buy this for 50 drachma. Now it's going to cost you 10 euros, and maybe that price has gone up by 30%, but your wages have not gone up. Also, since they have this sort of collective money that they're spending, they want to impose rules. So, for example, in France, they would let people retire quite young. They have a much shorter work week than, say, they would in Germany. And in Greece, they also have a lot of early retirement, government pensions, this sort of thing, which, of course, now the people say in Germany say, well, we work hard and we don't get that. And now the people in Greece get that. And basically our money is being used to subsidize the economy of Greece, to subsidize Portugal and Spain and Ireland. And so with that then comes some pushback to say if we're going to have to pay for it, we're going to tell you what to do. And of course, this is normally the case. If somebody is paying for something, they want to control somewhat what's happening. Probably the same way with your parents, right? If your parents are paying for your education or paying for things in your life, then they're probably concerned with the way you are spending that money. And of course, there's one way to solve that. That's to start paying for it yourself. But obviously, that's problematic. Well, let's move on. Let's take a look at Eastern Europe now after communism. Eastern Europe was, of course, controlled. This map's a little bit fuzzy on my screen, but you see, my main idea here is you see all of these countries that are here. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Belarus, all of these countries here in Eastern Europe. All of them were dominated by the Soviet Union. And they were communist parties took over and ran that, but those communist parties were basically the arm of the Soviet Union, took their orders from Moscow for the most part. Eastern Europe also comes under the Warsaw Pact. This is a military alliance, much like NATO, I guess you might say. But this sort of tied them in militarily, economically, politically to the Soviet Union. Now, when all that begins to fall apart in the late 80s and these countries begin to gain their independence, new challenges come to them because they want a more democratic government. They want free markets, free market economies. Many of them want to join NATO, which is the opposite. They're shifting from Warsaw Pact to NATO, and NATO is still around. The Warsaw Pact is basically gone. There's nothing left of it. And the European Union, even, they want to join. So we see, for example, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, they joined NATO in 1997. By 2004, in addition to joining NATO, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania joined the European Union. Okay, so they become members of the European Union, and by 2013, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia joined the European Union. And so this really changes the map across Europe, is that now these areas that we would call Eastern Europe, right, all the way up here to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovenia, all of them now have joined the European Union, and they have moved their economy much more into a free market, and their governments multi-party, much more democratic governments as well. So this has presented a lot of challenges. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Empire, we could call it, has led to the growth of nationalism and the growth of a lot of upheaval. You see, prior to say 1989, people chose sides. You either were with the East or you were with the West. You're either with the Soviets or you're with the United States primarily. And now, since 89, 90, there is only one superpower. It's the United States. The Soviets have fallen apart. The Russian Republic certainly is not of the same capacity to control and bring aid and so forth to all these countries. So nationalism has resurged. We're going to talk some about that. But this has created a lot of problems across the world, but certainly in Europe. One of the hot spots is going to be down here in what's called the Balkan states, the former Yugoslavia. Notice this area that's white down here. That area and over to Bulgaria and so forth. These areas are known as the Balkans. This is where World War I started, if you remember. But there are a lot of ethnic groups there. There's a lot of languages there, and we're going to talk about that. This had been under one umbrella. 6 different groups have been under one umbrella here, and this is called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is really an artificial country. I think everyone would agree. It was a hodgepodge of different languages, cultures, religions. You have Eastern Orthodox Christians. You have Roman Catholic Christians. You have Muslims. You have people speaking a wide variety of languages, which aren't even always in the same language groups. So they don't. There's just a lot of differences that are there, and its history is kind of complicated as well. Just to try to make it as simple as I can, they were under the Ottoman Empire up until the Ottoman Empire began to collapse certainly at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. The Austro-Hungarian Empire takes over parts of this territory, and Then we see from that, after World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and we see the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Even in the name of the kingdom, you see three major groups that are there. And then, of course, after that, we see it's called Yugoslavia. And so, in the 20s or so, that name begins to be used. By 1943, the Axis powers, mostly Germany, invades Yugoslavia, and the kingdom ends at that point. The king is in exile for a while, and then after the war, of course, when Germany loses, this territory goes to the Soviet Union, and a communist government is formed there. So once that happens, we will see pretty soon after that the rise of a leader in Yugoslavia who will rule it really with an iron fist, who rule it completely from 1953 to 1980. His name was Tito. And so he holds all this together. All these different groups are held together, these different groups, by his sort of personal power and influence. But when communism falls, he leaves he dies in 1980, and the leaders that come after him sort of sticks together. Things begin to fall apart. Communism falls apart, and the communist government there falls apart. And so now, what do we see happening? Well, because Tito had even kept the Soviets at bay to some regards, but it was still communist. There are 6 ethnic republics with different languages, cultures, and religions that are here in this area that was once called Yugoslavia. And here they are. There's Bosnia and Herzegovina. That is one republic. Croatia, the Socialist Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. Now, these will all begin to emerge. They all want to be independent, and there's a lot of upheaval in what happens here. Now, this map that perhaps you've been watching off to the side here changes, and I'm not going to try to explain it all, but here you see 1989, it's all Yugoslavia. It begins to be divided, 1991, 1992, later in 1992. You can see how complicated that it gets and how fragmented it gets. And so we're going to talk about some of that. I'll point out where some of the places are. Here's Belgrade, of course, and here is Sarajevo, and Zagreb up here. So I'll just let that scroll through for a second. One more time. It's going to come back and start. And let's look at it. Yugoslavia in 89 begins to divide. More divisions, 91, 92. Now we're going to talk more about this because it's also going to be filled with a lot of violence. One of the leaders of this time is Slobodan Milosevic, a Serbian leader. And he is pushing, and there's a real push for nationalism. And of course, he is pushing for Serbian nationalism. As all of these groups begin to, as these nationalism spreads and people want their independence, different groups, Slovenia and Croatia declared they were going to be independent in 1991. And what Serbia, for the most part, is trying to do is maybe kind of hold together Yugoslavia under their power, at least big parts of it. But what Milosevic will say is, well, there are Serbian minorities in your countries here because we're going to see that there were minorities there. And basically what he's kind of pushing for is all the areas where the Serbs live should be joined in with the rest of Serbia and to create a kind of larger Serbia area. Eventually this leads to warfare. It gets kind of complicated, but Serbia attacks these new republics, has most success most successful taking land from Croatia. About a third of Croatia will come under Serbian control. And we'll see that then later when Bosnia and Herzegovina, which by the way is one territory, normally just maybe called Bosnia, they are attacked in 1993 by the Serbians. And about 70% of Bosnian territory is taken by the Serbs there. But a lot of bloodshed, a lot of problems there. And in fact, the Serbs carry out a way they want to get rid of the Muslims. You know, over 50% of the people in Bosnia are Muslims. And they actively begin to kill these people. They begin to put them in camps. They begin to move them out. It reminds many people of sort of what happened to the Jews by the Nazis, the way that they were put into camps and moved out and killed. At any rate, by 1995, about 250,000 Bosnian Muslims have been killed. About 2 million are homeless in different camps and different things like this. So this has led to a lot of problems there. And in fact, it's also incited Muslim who are, you know, in other parts of the world, who see this as the way that the West treats Muslims. And so this is actually fanned the flames of Muslim radicals, some of which who flock to this area as well. And so we see. Well, the problems don't stop there, even though they get a kind of ceasefire in Bosnia. Kosovo was an area mostly of Albanians that was part of Serbia. The area around the city of Kosovo, the region of Kosovo, wanted to be independent. Of course, Milosevic and his forces attempt to stop that. They come in and attack them. Finally, NATO and the United States gets involved in this. They wanted to force Milosevic out of Kosovo. They began bombing runs. Primarily, it was in the form of bombings. And so, you know, there's just been a great upheaval. Now, finally, by 2006, all 6 republics were independent. So those former 6 republics that we talked about that had made up Yugoslavia are now independent. And by the way, Milosevic himself was charged with war crimes. He was taken to The Hague and put on trial for his war crimes, and he was on trial there for 4 years, 5 years. He died in his cell. Many people say of a heart attack. Other people speculated, oh no, people wanted to get rid of him, as you might think. But at any rate, he dies there without the final decision in his case, and so Milosevic out of the picture, and we see then 6 republics are there. But you see just a kind of a bloody history. Here you see a picture of Sarajevo in 1992. Mortar shells had come in, and in fact you can see people who have been hit by those mortars in this picture. Well, let's move then to post-communist Russia, and this will be, I think, our last screen. Boris Yeltsin, we talked about him before. He becomes president of the Russian Republic in 1991, after Gorbachev steps down, after the Soviet Union dissolves, and he is the president of the Russian Republic. He's going to bring in freer markets and freer elections to Russia, but they face a lot of problems. Economically, there are problems now because, you know, their whole empire has crumbled. Everything has to be readjusted. There's nationalism they have to deal with, independence movements. There's lots of corruption within the society, within the government. You know, there's gangs or mafia, Russian mafia that's there. There are sort of very rich and powerful people who are trying to stay in power and get richer, I guess. So this leads to a lot of troubles there. And plus, for Yeltsin, was the area of Chechnya. Chechnya is a primarily Muslim area that was in the southern part of the Russian Empire, but this was maintained within the Russian Republic. It didn't. They want their independence. They want to have a free Chechnya. And for a while they do, but the Russians have fought two different wars with Chechnya. Chechnya currently is a part of the Russian Republic. Yeltsin was a controversial figure. He certainly, most people believe he abused alcohol, for one thing. He would get involved in scandals of various kinds. I won't go into all of them here, but eventually his health concerns and probably some of those ideas, caused him to resign in 1999. That brings, his sort of second in command, or someone who had been working with him for part of his time in power, Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, you've probably heard about in the news, is the leader of the Russian Republic. And he rises to power in 1999. He said he would not fit corruption, but fix corruption and control Chechnya. And he does fight a war there. He does bring Chechnya back into the Russian Republic. It's a very tense situation there still. By the way, he was supposed to be president for 8 years. Then he was supposed to step down, according to the Constitution of Russia. And so he does, but he brings his sort of second in command and makes him president, and he is prime minister, basically. So he keeps running things through the 8 years of that guy's term, right? So, and then he said he was going to run, that, there was nothing that forbade him from running a third term and fourth term. So he's basically been working on changing the Constitution to make sure he can stay in power. And so he was just recently reelected. And so it appears he will be in power until 2024 at least. Well, Putin is a controversial figure. The economy does improve somewhat. The influence of Russia is rising somewhat, but they face many challenges. For example, challenges with Crimea, with the Ukraine and Crimea. And so the Russian troops go in and annex Crimea in 2014. This is an area along the Black Sea that they moved their troops in. No one did anything. No one sent any troops. The United States, NATO. They just they did this. They let this happen. I don't know, for good or for ill. And like I said, Putin is manipulating the system to stay in power. He is in power. He's basically been in power since 1999, and it appears he will be in power till 2024 at least. Oh, by the way, these pictures here, this is Boris Yeltsin, and this is somebody from Chechnya, a Muslim, praying while you see there's been an explosion and a gas fire behind him, still praying. Currently, falling oil prices. The Russians have been moving in to gain influence in Syria and the Middle East again. I mean, they've had power influence there before and perhaps continuing, but they want to expand that, and they're moving into these areas as well as others. But they're currently, oil prices are dropping, and this is hurting their economy, plus the corruption's there. Putin was accused, I guess we'd say, of using the Russian hackers and that sort of thing to try to influence the election of 2016. And, there's certainly probably did, and still trying to bring influence that way. So here he is, Boris Yeltsin. the current longtime ruler of Russia. But we're going to leave it there for now, and we will continue on with the rest of this chapter later.